Now let's take a closer look at kicking and the developmental sequence of this type of ballistic skill. In comparison to throwing, kicking is far less well studied. Although developmental steps or sequences have been observed and characterized based on cross-sectional studies, these developmental steps have not been validated with longitudinal studies following individuals over time. Similar to throwing, the best or most advanced kinematic patterns are observed when the goal is to kick for distance. Like other ballistic skills, including throwing, kicking is an open kinetic chain movement. Again, what I mean by this is that the movement or force generation of each segment contributes to the final movement at the foot. This happens in a proximal to distal pattern. What I mean by this is that the transfer momentum from the trunk influences the upper leg, which then influences the lower leg, which would be the most distal segment. Kicking is defined as a ballistic strike with the foot. Kicking requires eye-foot coordination to make contact with the ball. This task is easier for stationary versus moving objects because the movement of the ball needs to be tracked by the eyes, and then the movement of the leg needs to be well timed to intercept and project the ball. Let's take a closer look at a few real examples of kicking. We will first start with an early kicker. Pay close attention to the action of the legs, trunk, and arms. Now let's examine an intermediate kicker. Again, pay attention to the action of the legs, trunk, and arms. Let's sum up what we just observed. The early kicker is characterized by no step with a non-kicking leg, and the kicking leg pushes the ball forward with no wind-up. In contrast, the intermediate kicker is characterized with a small step with a non-kicking leg. There is a wind-up or backswing phase in which the kicking leg is cocked. At contact, the knee is bent, and there is not a full range of motion in the hip or knees. Now let's examine a proficient kicker. Again, pay close attention to the action of the legs, trunk, and arms. The proficient kicker is characterized as follows. There is a large step with a non-kicking leg. There is a large wind-up with the kicking leg. During the swing phase, the thigh rotates forward and the lower leg extends before contact. There is a full range of motion at the hip and knee for the kicking leg. The trunk generates additional force. And lastly, the arm moves in opposition such that if I am kicking with my right foot, my left arm swings forward. Now let's take a closer look at punting and the developmental sequence for this type of ballistic skill. Although there are many similarities between kicking and punting, punting is a slightly more complex skill. Punting requires excellent eye-foot coordination to make contact with the ball. Whereas with kicking, in which the ball can be stationary, in punting the ball is moving, and as such it requires appropriate timing of the ball drop and the kicking motion. The developmental sequence for punting has been validated by longitudinal studies following individuals over time. The developmental sequence can be broken into three parts: the arm action at ball release, the arm action at ball contact, and the leg action at ball contact. Let's take a closer look at a few real examples of punting. We will first start with an early punter. Pay attention to the action of the arms during the ball release, the ball contact phase, and the leg at the ball contact phase. Now let's take a look at a proficient punter. Again, pay attention to the action of the arms during the ball release and contact phases, and the leg action during the ball contact phase. Let's summarize the difference between early and proficient punters. The early punter tosses the ball up and contacts the ball with her toes. In contrast, the proficient punter extends his arms fully at ball drop. His arms drop to the sides and move in opposition to the legs. He leaps onto the support leg and swings the punting leg through a full range of motion. The punting leg is kept straight with the toes pointed at ball contact. The observational plan for the arm action at ball release has 4 developmental steps. In step 1, the ball is tossed upwards. This can result in a toss that is not centered with the foot and can lead to adjustments and inconsistencies in the movement as a result. In step 2, the ball is dropped from chest height, but the timing of the drop is late, meaning that the ball is dropped after the support foot has touched the ground. In step 3, the ball is dropped from waist height, which reduces the time to contact, but again the timing of the drop is late or after the support foot has touched the ground. In step 4, the ball is dropped from chest height and is early, meaning that the ball is dropped before the support foot has touched the ground. This results in a greater ball velocity at the point of contact because the ball moves a greater distance from the release point. This is illustrated in the figure to the right. The observational plan for the arm action at ball contact has 3 developmental steps. In step 1, the arm drops to the side at ball contact. In step 2, the arms move out to the sides or abduct. In step 3, the arms move in opposition to the leg movement. This oppositional movement is illustrated in the figure to the left. When the person takes a step with the left foot, the right arm moves. When the person tries to kick with the right foot, the left arm moves. The observational plan for the leg action at ball contact has 3 developmental steps. In step 1, there is no step taken with a non-punting foot, or there is a very small step taken with a non-punting foot. In addition, the ankle is dorsiflexed, meaning that the toes are pointing up. In step 2, there's a long step with a non-punting foot, and the ankle is plantarflexed on the punting foot. In step 3, there's a long leap onto the non-punting foot. This leap allows the greatest force generation and transfer of momentum to the kicking foot. Before transitioning to striking skills, let's summarize what we have observed for punting and kicking. Both kicking and punting require good eye-foot coordination and appropriate sequencing and timing of movements if the ball is moving. Large steps or leaps with a non-kicking or punting foot, oppositional arm movements, and a full range of motion with the kicking and punting leg are characteristics of proficient kickers and punters. Let's now change gears and take a closer look at striking. We will first examine sidearm striking. Sidearm striking is a form of striking in which the arm remains at or below shoulder level. Examples of sidearm striking include a baseball swing, a tennis forearm swing, or a golf swing. Sidearm striking is not well studied, and the developmental sequence for striking is based on striking a stationary ball, like hitting a ball off a tee or from a hanging tether. Similar to kicking a moving ball or punting, striking depends on perceptual development, meaning eye-hand coordination in this case. Interestingly, the mechanical properties are similar despite the many different types of sports and physical activities that require sidearm striking, and the involvement of different body segments and body orientations. For example, in tennis, you can have a single-hand forearm swing, a single-arm backhand swing, a two-hand version of each of these 2 types of swings, and you can be facing forwards or to the side. Despite the variability of these types of movements, the basic mechanical principles and the developmental sequences are very similar. Again, to get a better sense of the developmental stages of this skill, let's examine some real examples of early, intermediate, and proficient sidearm striking. We will start with observing an early striker. Pay attention to the movements of the legs, trunks, arms, and striking implement. Now let's observe an intermediate striker. Again, pay attention to the movements of the legs, trunk, arms, and striking implement. Finally, let's observe an advanced striker. Again, pay attention to the movements of the legs, trunk, arms, and striking implement. Let's summarize the differences in early and proficient sidearm strikers. The early strikers' arm movements are characterized as chopping motions with just elbow extension. there is very little leg and trunk movement. In contrast, the proficient sidearm striker starts the movement in a sideways preparatory stance. He takes a long step. He shows differentiated trunk rotation. The horizontal swing moves through a large range of motion, and the arm is extended just before contact. The proficient striker's movements are sequential. There is a backswing, forward step, pelvic, then spinal rotation, forward swing with arm extension, and a full follow-through. The sequence of movements for the foot and trunk action in sidearm striking is similar to the developmental sequences for those movement components in the overarm throw. Moreover, the developmental stages are also similar. With respect to the foot action, there is a transition from no step, small step, to large step. With respect to the trunk action, there is a transition from no rotation, block rotation, and differentiated rotation. The movement sequence for the other components are specific to striking. For example, with respect to the swing, there is a transition from vertical or chopping movements to horizontal movements. With respect to the grip on the implement, there is a transition between using a power grip, which is shown on the left figure, and a handshake grip, which is shown on the right figure. With respect to the arm position, there is a transition from holding the elbow close to the body to moving it away from the body and extending the arm during the swing. The observational plan for sidearm striking is relatively simple. The foot, trunk, and humerus components are the same for that of overhand throwing. Therefore, the major difference is with the racket or bat action. In step 1, we have mentioned that the racket is moved in a vertical direction like a chopping movement. In step 2, the racket and arm move together. In step 3, the racket lags the forearm but is not yet in the front-facing position. In step 4, the racket lags until the shoulders are in the full front-facing position. Now let's discuss the developmental patterns for overarm striking. Although we will discuss some distinct differences in the arm action for overarm striking, many of the basic mechanical principles and qualitative developmental changes are similar to sidearm striking. Overarm striking is characterized as a striking movement in which the arm travels above the shoulder level. This movement may be performed with or without an implement. An example of an overarm strike without an implement is an overhand volleyball serve. An example of an overarm strike with an implement is an overhand tennis serve. Early overarm striking is similar to throwing and sidearm striking in that there is either no step or a homolateral step, meaning that if I strike the ball with my right arm, I step with my right leg. There is very little trunk movement. The arm extends forward without a backswing. The arm and racket move together and the elbow stays bent throughout the swing phase of the movement. In contrast, proficient overarm striking is characterized by the elbow angle between 90 and 119 degrees at the start of the movement. There is a large contralateral step. There is differentiated pelvic and spinal rotation of more than 90 degrees. There is a large backswing. There is humerus, forearm, and racket lag. The trunk rotates, then the humerus moves, then the forearm moves, then the racket moves. The point of contact with the ball is high, and the arm is extended at contact. Overall, the force is generated by correctly timing the sequences of these different movements from the foot to the racket. Table 8.4 shows a developmental sequence for overarm striking proposed by Mezek in 1991. The sequence was based on a cross-sectional study of 9 to 19-year-olds performing a tennis swing. This sequence is consistent with the developmental sequence described by Langendorfer in 1987. Again, there are many similarities to overarm throwing and sidearm striking, but there are also some unique features. For example, the foot action in overarm throwing doesn't really apply to overarm striking. Although there is a weight shift that's important, the stepping action isn't very relevant to the overall sequence of movements. This is likely due to the rules about not stepping over the line during a tennis serve. This could be considered a task constraint, which changes the types of movements that evolve. Research investigating the movement sequences and patterns of striking in older adults primarily examines golf. For example, Jagosinski et al. In 1997 examined older and younger golfers. The younger group was comprised of 19 to 25-year-olds, whereas the older group was comprised of 60 to 69-year-olds. This study found that older golfers used a faster tempo and speed of their shots. They reached peak force earlier in their swing rather than at ball contact. They exerted more force for the same type of shot, suggesting that their movements were less efficient and more effortful. Although there were no differences in the accuracy of the shots compared with young golfers, there is an increased variability from shot to shot in the older golfers. Importantly, the lack of large differences in the movement patterns may be due to the fact that age-related decreases in strength and flexibility in older adults is less likely to impact golf performance compared to other movements like jumping or running. Haywood and Williams in 1995 examined differences in movement patterns in older tennis players. They split their group into older adults ages 62 to 68 and another group aged 69 to 81. There were no differences between these two groups. Keep in mind that the golf study that we described in the last slide considered its, quote, older group to be between the ages of 61 to 69, and the younger group was 19 to 25. So it's possible that if we compared all of the individuals in the Haywood and Williams study to young adults, there may be noticeable differences between the groups. However, within the two groups of older adults, there don't seem to be any noticeable changes. In addition to not finding group differences, the study also did not find any sex differences in overhand tennis serves. Most of the tennis serves were characterized as moderate levels of skill for the trunk, forearm, and racket movements. The older group was slightly more advanced for the elbow movement, and there were no differences in shoulder flexibility. So the take-home message from this study is that the well-developed movements of these older tennis players are maintained in older adulthood, despite the possibility of reduced strength or flexibility in old age. Okay, let's summarize everything we've learned with respect to the development of ballistic skills like throwing, kicking, punting, and striking. First, we discussed the developmental sequences for each of these skills, and when appropriate, we have examined the validated observational plans that can be used to determine the stage of various movement components for each skill. Second, it is clear that more research, particularly longitudinal studies that follow individuals over time, are necessary to validate movement sequences for kicking and striking. Third, the basic mechanical principles needed for generating force and speed in ballistic skills results in a similar pattern or sequence of development across different skills. The sequence and timing of these different components are necessary to take advantage of the open kinetic chain. The basic pattern is that momentum is transferred from the legs through the step to the trunk through differentiated hip and shoulder rotation, to the upper arm through lag, and to the forearm through lag, and lastly to the implement or the body part that's contacting the object to be projected. Lastly, individual and task constraints contribute to the different developmental patterns observed for these different skills.